Welcome to Dot Citizen. I'm Chrisella Herzog.
And I'm Zachary Stickney.
And we are your hosts. So it's been a hot minute since we've
done
a podcast. Sorry, guys. Life kind of got in the way. Zach, why don't you start with what you've been up to?
I guess this is the problem with having lives outside of our true passion of podcasting.
Lives.
Yeah.
Only true
families
podcasters do not have lives.
I know. We're terrible. We are objectively terrible.
We are. Look at us.
Yeah. So I actually do have some cool news on the PhD front. I finished my coursework just this past spring, which means I only have about 37 more years of work to do. I have this coming spring comprehensive exams, which is going to be very exciting. Basically, I'll get to be locked in a room on 2 separate occasions for 8 hours and just write everything that I've ever learned.
Everything that's in your brain, just dump it onto the paper. Hopefully
in a coherent manner, so they'll pass me and move me on to the next thing. And then after that, it's off to dissertation writing, and I still need to nail that down. Honestly, I've got so many different threads of ways that it could go, but yeah, it's okay. It's still in a good place, but you know.
And the worst part is that we started this, so this could be the place where you dumped all of those different threads, and then we.
That was one of the goals.
Yeah.
Nailed it.
Yeah.
And so many things like this, it's ultimately just opened up more questions for me and more potential routes, and it's just oh my god.
Sorry.
I blame you.
Oh, yeah, it's all my fault. I'll take it. Yeah. Well, another reason why we have not done anything in a while absolutely has been my fault, as in I just got crazy busy with work and completely buried. But the sad part is that the work that I was buried in was not the work that necessarily pertains to this podcast at all. And in sad news, I have decided to put White Hat Magazine on hiatus for now. I couldn't make the business model work, and yeah, it's just it's a bummer. But
that's all right though, because it looks like you're crushing it on the other side of things.
Oh, thank you. The marketing business has been going better. So full disclosure, going forward in this podcast, I'm not working as a journalist anymore. I am working in marketing, and I run a marketing company. And I'm going to try really hard to make sure that doesn't influence this podcast, except to talk about hey, you know how it's really creepy that Facebook knows everything about you? Yeah. Here's how to opt out all of that. Go to the privacy settings at the bottom of the page. Opt out of everything. Facebook had to implement it because of GDPR. Do it.
I feel like that's still another podcast that we should potentially do, is just
Seriously,
a big how-to on
how
to
opt out of everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
Totally.
And the crazy part about it that I've learned is that you can't just opt out of everything once. You have to continually opt out of things. You have to make it like a routine that every few months you go back and opt out of everything because somehow it opted you back in without your permission.
It's so funny you bring this up, because this has become a recent major pet peeve of mine, because not only is that true for social media and things like that, but I've noticed with my cell phone, I'll opt out. I say, don't give me push notifications for any of these things. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, I'm getting push notifications from those apps.
Yeah.
And I'm just is there any way to win this thing?
I mean, I found that you can do it from the OS and opt out of it from that way rather than from within the app. But then as soon as you do an OS update on your phone, I just updated my phone to the newest version, and then all of a sudden it didn't keep any of those settings, and I had to go opt out of all the push notifications again because I already have 1 billion notifications on my phone at any given time, but this just caused my screen to explode, and it was bad.
Oh, no.
So
yeah, that's the worst feeling. But at any rate, we are back.
We're
in business. And Chrisella, what brings us here today?
Well, so that we could actually get this podcast moving again, instead of doing one of our deep dives into a topic, which will be coming back, today we decided to talk about a book that we have both reviewed or read and reviewed recently, and has just been one of those books that's kind of really stuck with both of us, I think, because it's such a powerful book. and also kind of a terrifying book in some ways. So we're going to talk this week about Virginia Eubank's book, Automating Inequality. So Virginia Eubanks is a professor of political science at the State University of New York, Albany, and she's also a political activist who digs into these issues of technology and privacy and really how these automated decision-making platforms that are permeating our lives are affecting that in some really kind of terrifying and scary ways. And in her book, Automating Inequality, she really digs into the part of technology that makes automated decisions or automates decisions for public services meant for the poor in the United States of America. And so when we're talking about automated decisions like this, we're talking about life and death decisions. So some of the things that she covers in the book is homelessness and access to housing, Medicaid, food benefits, child protective services, like really crucial decision-making processes that cause massive disruption in people's lives if they don't have access to these very basic human needs. And so she takes a deep dive into these issues in 3 cities: Los Angeles. Oh, I don't remember where in Indiana. I think it was just, so maybe not 3 cities,
I think it's just the whole state.
Yeah, the whole state of Indiana, and then Allegheny County in Pennsylvania. So 3 areas. So 3 very different areas of the country. And so while she is a professor of political science, what this book, I would say you could really describe this book as being a very much an investigative journalism piece, diving into these different issues and following her subjects along to illustrate how these automated decision-making systems really impact the lives of people, the people that she's following. So.
Absolutely. And I think just kind of following up on that, I think really one of the big picture things that starts to emerge from this book is, I mean, she didn't choose these places because they were like the worst of the worst. These are like the big horror stories of automated decision making. She's actually talked a lot about how these 3 areas were actually very intentional about the process where with the algorithms that they were creating, the kind of information that they were putting into the systems. They thought deeply about. They connected with a lot of experts in these fields to try to make these things as effective as possible and to try to...
Maybe not Indiana.
Maybe that's not the case.
Maybe not Indiana.
But I think, like, you know, at least in a general sense, they were trying to... Actually, the Indiana point's very apt. But in a general sense, they wanted to, you know, not criminalize everybody and make everything terrible, but they wanted to try to make an impact on the populations that they were serving.
Yeah, I think they wanted to streamline what they were working on in a way that so they maybe could serve more people and be more effective across a larger number of people through more efficient systems.
Yeah.
That might be the most generous interpretation of Indiana systems that I will give. But I mean, for Indiana, they explicitly said that they wanted it to be a cost-saving measure. They wanted to cut overhead costs in their Medicaid and welfare systems there.
But I think that's the key point right there, right? Is like this idea that they came into these processes thinking that a lot of these problems could essentially be engineered away on some level, and that if with the right technology, with the right amount of data, or improving the flow of data, or whatever it is, they could solve some of their core problems. And even, you know, if it's saving money, maybe they can serve more people with the money they saved. If it's in the case of Los Angeles, with this information, maybe they can get housing to people who could really have their lives changed by bringing that sort of project to them. But the key takeaway for me from reading this book is like that none of these issues can be engineered away. These are really questions of core values, core, like, what are the inputs that we're putting into these algorithms. In spite of all that, and in spite of the immense resources that went into these programs, the thought that often went into them, ultimately they failed to bring about the core things that they set out to do. And so the key takeaway from here is that we can't engineer ourselves out of inequality. We can't engineer ourselves out of problems like racism or climate change or so many other problems. And that was kind of one of the key things that came for me out of this book, is that it's really a question of our values, and what we really need to do is interrogate what values we're putting into these technological things that we're creating.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is a pattern. This is a pattern I've at least noticed ever since reading this book, is how we keep trying to solve big problems with artificial intelligence or automated systems, thinking that, if we create a computer program to, handle these issues where human emotions and human mistakes can cause, these really thorny issues, if we hand that over to a computer, maybe that will solve all of our problems dispassionately. And it's just not the case. Over and over again, we find that when we are building these programs, the very human biases of the people who build them end up coming through in disastrous ways in these programs. So you can think of, an example that goes actually several years back, the hand washing machines, like the automated hand washing machines that you see, for the longest time would not activate if a person of color tried to use them, because they were never tested on anybody's hands but a white person's hands.
Wow.
Yeah. So like there's just starting the freaking faucet,
Yeah.
And then there was another story that I was just mentioning to you before we started this podcast, is there is a company that's trying to create a system for facial recognition for job candidates, thinking that if they can somehow find patterns in facial recognition or bone structure, which find those patterns to, say who's going to be a really good candidate. Okay. First of all, that seems a little bit creepy, like going back to like, hey,
to say the least.
Yeah. Let's be like, the shape or the size of someone's head is not a determiner of intelligence. That, no, this is bad. We can't go back to this, and we can't create software that is like determining people's access to jobs because of this. Like,
haven't we been through this before?
Oh, apparently we never learned.
I guess not. It seems pretty cyclical.
Yeah.
But maybe let's talk about that for a second. Some of these kind of biases and challenges that are raised specifically in Virginia Eubank's book in Automating Inequality.
Yeah.
So one of the things that, and we keep bringing up this Indiana welfare system thing, and I think it's because that one was really based on kind of this idea of identifying the deserving poor and then excluding the rest.
Yeah, I agree. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so, basically the inputs that they're looking for and the outputs that they're trying to achieve are one, and I think you said this quite correctly, is it how can we do this in the most efficient way? How can we make the most cost-saving measures? We want to decrease our overhead. And what that ultimately looked like was, what it looked like in practice was kind of changing everything down to the relationships that social work practitioners even had with their clients. Virginia Eubanks talks about this idea how there used to be this system of case-based management where social workers would have, a face-to-face interaction with who they were working with.
Which I think when people think of social work and think of these sorts of things, that's the picture that they have in their head.
Right.
Is, you go in and you talk to a caseworker about your stories, and that caseworker makes a determination on, what kind of services you can get. But that's what Indiana basically completely did away with.
Yeah. And that's kind of the crazy thing, is like it went from this situation where they'd know you personally, they'd know some of the background, the context around your life. And it's kind of switched to this task-based thing where instead of having that face-to-face interaction, they're getting this file with information about you on a computer, certain tasks to complete to try to create the most efficient outcome for you. And if you're not eligible for, SNAP benefits or something like that, if you had a face-to-face interaction with someone, they still might be able to offer some way to help by, maybe pointing you in the direction of a food bank or something like that. Mm-hmm. But now, when that connection is removed, all of a sudden they have nothing, and all you get is this rejection letter or automated phone call, as it is in not many cases.
Right.
And that's the whole system.
And the other thing that really stood out to me with that system is how because it became this task-based system, how impersonal the process of maintaining benefits became. Like, there was the example, there were actually several examples. The little girl who lost her benefits because they hadn't filed some paperwork correctly, even though her parents were diligent, hardworking people and trying to navigate this crazy maze of a process. They misfiled or missed one piece of paper, and then all of a sudden their daughter's life-saving benefits get cut off. Then there was another example that like really just stuck with me, of a woman who was in the hospital for ovarian cancer. I mean, she's in the hospital. She can't make it in to like turn something in to the state office sort of thing. So she tries to call up and say so. All she can get is a machine. And so the state denies her benefits, and which means that she got cut off from her medical treatments, her medicine. She got cut off from the free rides that she was getting to her treatments. And so she died because she wasn't getting treatments. And then the day after she died, her appeal went through, said, oh, yeah, you were wrongfully terminated from your benefits, and had her benefits restored the day after she died. All because like she couldn't call somebody and say, hey, I'm in the hospital. I can't make it today. Can I make an extension or something? Like, just,
right.
Ugh.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's another thing that I think this book does really well, is it because when we talk about these things, I think too often it gets into this sort of abstractions about what's going on, right? And like, and you know, I'm studying political science. I don't understand specifically how to code these algorithms. I don't think any one individually does anyway, right? Because it's entire teams.
It is entire teams, yeah. And often
process.
And often how coding of these sorts of systems work is that it's not even one team that's building the entire process. They are relying on open source code to build snippets of it. And so you're getting this code from somewhere out there in the world, and you have no idea who built it necessarily, except for maybe their username. And then a lot of these machine learning processes that these artificial intelligence algorithms are based on come from larger corporations like IBM or Microsoft or something like that, who have the capacity to build these large processing machines that are required to process all of this data. And so there's like a whole nother team that's incredibly large, and the right hand might not know what the left hand is doing with it. But what ends up happening is that nobody is really able to, you just can't control for biases at that sort of scale.
Yeah.
So, and you might not even be aware of what's being built into your code. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why it's so important that this book highlights sort of the real human effects that are emerging from this, and kind of brings front and center why figuring out these issues is so important, and why we shouldn't just be so excited to, you know, jump the gun, so to speak, and get the next biggest cool thing, like, without really thinking through what it's going to look like in practice.
Well, and another point that she makes in this book is how some of these systems of surveillance and profiling and exclusion get tested on the poorest populations, or the most vulnerable populations first.
Yeah.
So in this case, I think one of the reasons why she highlighted so many poor women in this book is because poor women are often the most vulnerable, especially if they're a poor woman of color. They're often the most vulnerable populations. They cannot fight back against these systems that are forcing them down this particular path. And so, but once these systems are tested on more vulnerable populations, then they're able to expand into the rest of our society. And so what we end up seeing is these patterns of, you know, surveillance and containment and profiling start popping up in our, you know, even in our middle class lives, where we can't opt out of it. You know, we can't opt out of the online surveillance. And I mean, I think you were reading the book Surveillance Capitalism.
Yeah, that's right. And hopefully that's another one we'll get to visit for this book project.
I have to read it first. I haven't gotten to it yet. But yeah, so it's kind of along those lines, how, you know, these systems start being tested with the most vulnerable populations, and then they grow to encompass all of the rest of us as well. So while, yes, we can read this book, and I do think it's very important to read this book and be like, this is awful what we are doing to the poorest, most vulnerable populations of our country. But we also need to realize that those systems are also coming for us.
Yeah.
And they will get us because they're just going to sneak right up on us. And it's terrifying.
And that's such a good point, because actually, Virginia talks about this in the book as well at the end. She kind of ends with a couple of questions that she feels should sort of guide the kinds of, the kinds of products that we create, or the kinds of institutions that we try to influence with these, with this kind of technology. And she asks two main questions that she thinks are a kind of gut check as to whether or not we should go forward with something. And the first one is, in particular with reference to the poor, does this tool increase the self-determination and agency of the poor? And the second question is, would this tool be tolerated if it were targeted at non-poor people? And I think that's so important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And actually, that's one question that I have for you as well as part of our discussion.
Sure.
We'll just go ahead and shoot for it here.
Yeah.
So I guess a follow-up on that would be, what other questions do you think should be asked to ensure the ethical use of these types of tools? And that's a big one. So
that is a big one, because the more I've been learning about it, the more I'm starting to feel like we can't use these systems ethically.
Yeah.
Because over and over again, you start seeing discriminatory patterns being built into these, even when like it's completely unintentional. And while I'm thinking about how to answer your question, I'm going to give an example.
Yeah.
So very recently on Twitter, there was a tweet that went viral. The founder of Ruby on Rails got an Apple credit card. And he got a pretty big limit on it because, he's a CEO and, all this fun stuff. But his wife got a credit limit on her card that was like 10 times smaller than his. They share assets. They have like the same bank accounts. And still she got like such a smaller credit limit on her card. Also, she has to pay her card off in full every month. Mm-hmm. And even when she pays her card off in full every month, she can't spend anything on it until the next month's cycle starts. So she can't just, it's the weirdest thing.
Yeah.
And then Steve Wozniak, co-founder of Apple, chimes in and says, the same thing happened to me.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm like, so Apple has a problem with that. But the point I wanted to make with this is that, and Apple also is being investigated by New York State for discrimination now. So we'll see what happens there. But the point I wanted to make with this is that this is algorithms continuing discriminatory practices for women accessing credit that has been going on for years. So women have only been able to open a credit card in their own name since 1974. And even still, like, the disparities in access to credit for women is crazy. So I did a dive into this a while ago. And women business owners, when they apply for a loan, if they get it, they only get 2.5. I can't remember the exact number, but they get a lot less of what a man applying for a business loan gets.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so they get an incredibly small amount, and this is based on long-standing patterns. So there's still a gender wage gap. So women make less money. And women are more likely to go to school, so we have higher student loans, so there's less disposable income there. So they go to start a business, and credit card companies see this, that they have this less disposable income than a man might have, and so the women get smaller loans. So that might not be a discriminatory decision on its own, like that the computer is making based off of looking at this, data, but the systemic things that are in place, our culture around women's wages and women's work still means that becomes a discriminatory result. So that's why I'm just like, I'm not sure if we can make these systems ethical anymore without making it so that there is human review or stronger regulation at every step of the process. Because you can, like with the credit card thing, you can make it so, yes, it is just based off the cold, hard data of income and disposable income and credit history. But none of that cold hard data takes into account the systemic factors that might cause those cold hard numbers to be the way that they are.
Right.
So, yeah, I'm not sure I have a great answer to that.
I don't know. I actually think that is a great answer.
Okay, well, good.
I mean, because I think that's probably the correct one, in the sense that there needs to be room for ambiguity. And I mean, I think there might be ways to integrate these tools where they might be helpful in making decisions in certain ways.
Mm-hmm.
But for it to be sort of the final, this is the answer you get. This is, for the example of women trying to be entrepreneurs and starting a business. I mean, if you have a system that's just automatically making that decision, I mean, we're going to keep getting the same results, and we're going to have we're going to keep asking the question, why don't we have more women CEOs?
Right.
And the answer is right there in front of us.
Because they could never get started in the first place. Yeah.
There's no starting point. So,
and my concern with this is that, if these automated systems are the ones making these decisions, that do not take anything into account for systemic factors, are they making think of it like civil rights fights are trying to break through this wall of these systemic factors. Are the algorithms actually fortifying that wall and making it harder for us to actually fight for equal rights and fight for civil rights? Is it sending us backwards so that we're becoming more ingrained in these discriminatory practices? Because we're like, oh, that's just how the system is. The computer makes the decision and it's unbiased. My fear is that it's going to get us more stuck in these systemic discriminatory systems rather than helping to liberate us from them.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and that's a serious issue, I think, because this kind of relates to another thought that I kind of had here is we are giving up so much of our agency to different tools like this. I mean, and on some level it is incredibly helpful. I mean, if I'm sitting there doing my taxes, I can't do without a calculator.
Right.
I mean, it just makes my life easier. I trust that it's giving me the correct answers, and I'm sort of giving up some level of my autonomy in believing that that's going to come out with the right result. But I think we sort of have this problem in our society where we have this idea of linear progress, especially in science and technology. And so we assume that, even if algorithms, these things are full of bias now, inevitably, if we just give them more data, if we, apply them in more situations, we're going to learn more about them and they're going to get better. But to bring it back to Virginia Eubanks, I think she also kind of tells us that sometimes these things get worse. It's not necessarily tomorrow is going to be better than today. We might be creating additional barriers for people. We might be systematically excluding people from getting access to these resources who really should have access to them. And we may be allowing ourselves to live by this value of saving money or being more efficient, when the value really needs to be interrogated, and we need to consider what the actual outcomes are for the lives that we're trying to change.
Yeah.
So there's my soapbox for today.
There you go. Soapbox. Need to make that a hashtag for this podcast. Hashtag soapbox. Well, I wanted to bring it back to automating inequality, and she is very explicit about calling this cyclical process out. She starts the book by examining the 19th century poorhouses and the systems in place there that were really dehumanizing to people in poverty. And, I think we kind of look back at that now. We're like, oh, yeah, that was terrible, but we're not going to do that again. But what she calls so I'm going to take a line from the New York Times review of the book. So she calls, or what this is what is happening now is we're creating a new regime of surveillance, profiling, punishment, containment, and exclusion, which Virginia Eubanks calls the digital poorhouse. So all of these things that we did before, we're doing it again, except this time with better tools to create this regime and create this system of dehumanizing poverty. And I think you made a great point before. It's not just dehumanizing the people who are in poverty, but also dehumanizing the system of people who are trying to help those in
Mhm.
poverty. Turning that system of, where it was a caseworker before, creating real human relationships with somebody, into just this task list where you just have to go through and be like, have you turned in this paperwork? No, then denied.
Mhm.
Like it's so dehumanizing, like
Yeah.
to just follow a checklist like that, when before you were actually like working to solve problems in people's lives and help people. It's very depressing.
Well, but even given all of the depression that can result from reading this book,
Yeah.
I think we both still would highly recommend it. I think, right?
Absolutely. I kind of want to buy a copy for everybody I know.
Yeah, absolutely. And as full disclosure, I still need to return Chrisella's copy. So be careful which friends you loan your books to, people. They might
dear.
hold on to them for like a year and a half.
Oops. I think the last point I want to make about my thoughts from automating inequality is how much this question and this book really goes to the heart of American culture and American politics today. So you can look at Virginia Eubank's book as being a book about automated decision making affecting public services, which sounds kind of dry. But I think what it really is it's an examination of this very core part of American culture where we punish the individual poor because we don't want, I don't know if it's because like we all want to believe that we're one day going to be millionaires or something like that, or what it is about our culture that does this. But like consistently in our culture in America, we see that we're and to take a quote from Virginia Eubanks, we manage the individual poor in order to escape our shared responsibility for eradicating poverty.
Wow.
And so we see this in, you see this in stories popping up where people are trying to apply for Medicaid benefits. Well, we want them to go get drug tested first, even though the number of people who are going to actually come up positive in those tests is minuscule. It just becomes like this process to punish the poor for being poor. And so I think we're also seeing this as being one of the major clashes that's coming up in the 2020 election between this fight over Medicare for all and on the other side going as far as repealing Obamacare. Like very, very basics of like, Obamacare was just like the very basics of trying to actually extend healthcare benefits to more people and actually make it so, people in poverty could access life-saving health insurance, like very, very basics. And we still want to repeal that, or there's a section of our society that still wants to repeal that, all in the name of, I'm not sure what it's in the name of, to be honest.
Yeah.
But then on the other side, there's this argument that we need to take collective responsibility for helping the most vulnerable among us actually access basic human rights like healthcare. And I think it's going to become one of the major clashes of the 2020 election, which I will say I'm not looking forward to. Not at all.
That'll be a fun future series for Dot Citizen, the 2020 election. Look forward to it, everyone.
Get to look forward to my hashtag soapbox.
If you weren't depressed enough with this discussion, don't worry. We've got some more hot takes coming your way.
We can be very depressing.
All right, and so if you are interested in Virginia Eubank's work, she still is doing a lot of work in this area. In fact, just this past October 2019, she posted an article in The Guardian titled "Zombie Debts Are Hounding Struggling Americans. Will You Be Next?" which was a wonderful October title, I think.
Very good, yes.
And what this article was about was this idea of basically there's a lot of new big data companies. They're getting contracts with state and local governments to dig up all this information from decades ago and connect it with other data sets and find out where people are living currently and essentially bring back debts from the dead that oftentimes people didn't even realize they had. So for one example, there was this family who apparently in the late 80s were receiving SNAP benefits, and apparently they were overpaid for those. They received too many benefits at the time. And now 30 years later, they're being asked to pay those back. And sometimes families will owe as much as, thousands and thousands of dollars. And oftentimes these people are still on different forms of benefits. The example from the article was a woman who's now in her 70s who's getting her Social Security check. She's got some disability payments coming in. And all of a sudden, this threat comes in the mail that says you owe us $3,000 for these things you received 30 years ago. And it's not only the debt itself that's frightening, but everything that's attached to it. The threat of losing current benefits that they might have. There's even been threats that their children might be required to pay back some of these debts. And so it's just another example in this work, this incredible work that Dr. Eubanks has done in exploring all the ways that these tools are being used to criminalize the most vulnerable people. So it's just unbelievable stuff, but such important work that she continues to do in highlighting this. So hopefully I'll use a technical political science term here, to get our heads out of our asses and just let people live their lives. Sorry for being so jargony, but is that okay?
Yes, that was great. Thank you for lightening the mood, because I was just sitting here like, you all can't see me, but I'm just sitting here like clenching fists, like shaking my head at this zombie debt thing. Like, I'm so angry about it. Like, ugh, yeah. But yeah, so we needed the mood lightener.
You're welcome. If you're interested in learning more about Virginia Eubank's work, there's a few places where you can find her. She is on Twitter. Her account is at PopTechWorks. That's PopTechWorks, PopTechWorks. And I will say that she is a really generous person with her time on Twitter. She's responded to some of my questions on occasion, which
that's awesome.
is it makes me feel pretty cool. I'm sitting here with my 230 followers, and all of a sudden somebody who's done this really cool work that I respect a lot talks to me. So it's validating. So in addition to the incredible investigative journalism Virginia Eubanks has done, she's also validated my existence. So, I mean, those are two very important contributions she's made to the world. She's also got a website, and that's just www.virginia-eubanks.com. So definitely check her stuff out and look forward to all the incredible work that I'm sure she'll continue to do.
All right, everyone. I think that's it for this week's episode of Dot Citizen. We hope you will subscribe, leave us a review, keep on listening to us. We'll be back sooner than later. It won't be a year this time. Oh my gosh. We are working on rebuilding our website, so we'll tell you next time where to go to find us online. Ooh, cool. But in the meantime, subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Bye.